You already know the shape of this story. Even if you can't name the company, a business built something people genuinely needed, grew fast, it went public, and put value statement on the wall of every branch that talked about integrity, about putting people first, about doing the right thing, even when nobody's watching. Meanwhile, somewhere below that wall is in the actual operating rhythm, nobody framed and hung anywhere. Employees were handed sales quotas so aggressive that hitting them honestly was nearly impossible. And so quietly, branch by branch, a portion of them started opening accounts customers never asked for, just to keep the numbers where head office needed them. When it finally came out years later, the fallout was enormous. Billions in fines, a CEO testifying in front of Congress with the particular blankness of a man who genuinely doesn't understand what he did wrong, thousands of employees terminated, some of them, it turned out, for the crime of raising their hand early and getting ignored. Here's a detail I want you to actually sit inside before we go any further, because it's the whole episode in miniature. Nobody in that boardroom ever wrote a policy that said commit fraud. The wall said integrity. The onboarding deck said people first. If you'd interviewed the executives responsible, most of them would have told you, and probably believed it, that they ran an ethical company. What they had actually built through quota design, through what got celebrated in the Friday email, through which regional managers got promoted and which quietly moved sideways, was a machine that manufactured exactly the behavior the wall claimed to condemn. Culture wasn't the sentence on the wall. Culture was whatever the incentive structure was actually, functionally, quietly willing to pay for. And that's the definition I want to work with today, because it's more useful than the one most of us default to. We tend to think of culture as vibe, the way an office feels, whether people smile in the hallway, whether there's a ping pong table and a values deck. Solomon never once writes about vibe. He writes constantly about a completely different mechanism. Who a leader keeps close, who a leader promotes, what a leader tolerates, the one time it's inconvenient to object. Culture, in the wisdom literature, is never a mood a company has. It's an architecture a leader builds, decision by decision, mostly in rooms too small to photograph for a careers page. I want to be fair to the wall for a second, because I don't think the instinct behind it is dishonest most of the time. Founders write those value statements sincerely. They mean integrity when they type it. The failure almost never happens at the level of the sentence. It happens 3 or 4 decisions downstream of the sentence in rooms where the value and the quarters numbers point in different directions. And somebody has to choose which one actually governs. Every company groaning under a toxic culture today started with a founder who would have been offended by the suggestion that they were building one. That's precisely what makes this dangerous rather than obvious. Nobody sets out to build the version that ends up in a congressional hearing. They set out to hit a target, and the target, left unexamined long enough, quietly wrote the culture on their behalf. Proverbs 25 verse 5. Remove the wicked from the king's presence, and his throne will be established through righteousness. Look closely at the mechanism in that verse, because it's doing something more specific than be a good king. It doesn't say the throne is established by the king's own righteous character in isolation, floating above everyone around him. It says the throne is established by an active decision about proximity. Remove the wicked from the presence, not from the kingdom generally. From the presence, from the room, from the inner circle where actual decisions get made and actual influence gets exchanged. A king can give flawless speeches about justice from a balcony and still preside over a corrupt court. If the people he actually keeps close, the people who have his ear at 10 at night when the public isn't watching, are people willing to bend the truth in his favor, the throne isn't established by what gets said in public. It's established by who gets tolerated in private. Proverbs 29 verse 2, when the righteous thrive, the people rejoice. When the wicked rule, the people groan. And notice what this second verse doesn't say. It doesn't say the people groan when the wicked speak. It says they groan when the wicked rule, when the influences actually reach the level of authority, of decision making, of consequence for other people's lives. A toxic voice with no power is unpleasant. A toxic voice with actual authority becomes the entire climate everyone downstream of it has to breathe. Proverbs 29 verse 12. If a ruler listens to lies, all his officials become wicked. That verb become is the one worth sitting with. Not a few bad officials happen to already be wicked when he hired them. Become. The organization actively reshapes itself over time around whatever the person at the top is actually willing to hear. Whichever version of a report gets rewarded, whichever messenger of bad news gets quietly frozen out, whichever flatterer gets promoted for being pleasant to have in the room. Nobody sends a memo instructing the staff to start lying. The staff simply learns the way water learns the shape of the container it's poured into. Which version of reality earns the ruler's approval, and the organization becomes that version, department by department, without a single explicit instruction ever being given. I think about a founder I worked with a few years ago who had genuinely one of the best public value statements I've ever read. Care, candor, ownership, all beautifully worded, all sincerely meant when he wrote it. And he also had quietly one direct report who was extraordinarily good at hitting numbers and extraordinarily comfortable belittling junior staff in meetings the founder was not in. Everyone below that person knew it. Everyone above them did, because the founder's actual proximity, who he golfed with, whose calls he took first, whose complaints he treated as noise versus signal, had already told the whole organization which behavior the values page was actually worth. The moment it collided with someone who could hit that number. He never once said cruelty was acceptable. He simply never removed it from his presence. And the throne, such as it was, got established on exactly that silence. What finally changed it wasn't a values retreat or kind of like a new post on the wall. It was one exit interview from a genuinely talented junior hire he respected that used the phrase he couldn't stop hearing afterward. I didn't leave because of the work. I left because I watched what you were willing to overlook and didn't want to become fluent in overlooking it too. He removed that direct report within the month, not loudly, not as a public morality play, just a quiet, overdue correction to who actually had his ear. He told me afterwards that the hardest part wasn't the decision itself, it was admitting how long he'd already known and how much of that knowledge he'd spent explaining away rather than acting on. Because the person in question was, by every visible metric on the dashboard, one of his best performers. Proverbs 25 verse 5 doesn't say removing the wicked from your presence is easy. It only promises that the throne gets established when you finally do it. Which is another way of saying the throne stays unstable no matter how good the numbers look for exactly as long as you don't. Let's look at the counsel of Jethro, for example. Another example in the Bible. There's an earlier story further back than Solomon that I think does more work on actual mechanics of building a culture than almost any other passage in scripture. And it really gets taught as a leadership text. Moses has just led the entire nation out of Egypt. He is by any reasonable measure the most qualified person in the camp to make every decision, closer to God than anyone in life, more experienced, more trusted. And he is, when his father-in-law Jethro arrives to visit, sitting from morning until evening, personally judging every single dispute that arises among hundreds of thousands of people alone, while a line stretches out in front of him that never gets shorter. Picture the actual scene for a second, because it's easy to skim past as background detail. An entire nation camped in the wilderness, and every property dispute, every accusation, every question of right and wrong that anyone anywhere in the camp needed settled has to physically walk to one tent and wait in one line, because one man has made himself the only trustworthy filter the whole culture is allowed to run through. Now, you know how this plays out. Jethro watches this for what the text implies is at least a full day before he says anything. And when he finally speaks, he doesn't lead with the fix, he leads with a diagnosis. Jethro's first observation is blunt, almost rude for a father-in-law to say out loud. What you are doing is not good. You and the people with you will certainly wear yourselves out. But the actual counsel that follows is the part with building an entire episode around, because it's not delegate more in the vague, forgettable way we hear that advice today, right? It's specific about the filter. And we pick that up in Exodus 18, verse 21. But select capable men from all the people, men who fear God, trustworthy men who hate dishonest gain, and appoint them as officials over thousands, hundreds, 50s, and 10s. 4 qualifiers, and it's worth noticing which 4 Jethro reaches for, because none of them is the one most of us would default to. Not loyal to you personally, not available right now, not has been here the longest, capable, actually able to do the job, not just willing, God-fearing, answerable to something above the organizational chart, which changes how a person behaves the one time nobody in the organizational chart is actually watching. Trustworthy, a track record, not a resume line. And the 4th one is the sharpest, hating dishonest gain. Not merely honest when it's convenient, actively repelled by the shortcut, the kickback, the quiet advantage nobody would catch. Moses wasn't failing because he lacked stamina. He was failing because, without meaning to, he had built a culture of one, every decision rooted through a single bottleneck, which meant every value in the camp was only ever as consistent as Moses' own attention span on any given afternoon. Watch what happens the moment the filter changes. The moment Moses starts appointing according to those 4 criteria rather than proximity or convenience, the culture of the entire camp stops depending on his personal presence in every dispute and starts depending on a structure that can hold his values even in rooms he'll never personally sit in. Only the hard cases still come to him. Everything else gets settled correctly thousands of times a day by people he will mostly never actually meet, because the filter he used to select them was strong enough to keep functioning without him standing over every decision checking their work. That's the actual definition of a culture worth following. Not a founder impressive enough to personally referee everything forever, but a set of criteria specific enough that the people you hand authority to will make roughly the decision you'd have made, or even better, for roughly the reasons you'd have made it, in the rooms you were never going to be in anyway. It's worth noticing that Jethro's filter deliberately excludes as much as what it includes. He doesn't say pick the people most like Moses. He doesn't say pick the people most loyal to Moses personally, a criterion that would have quietly rebuilt the exact bottleneck they were trying to dismantle, just with more names attached to it. He says pick for capability, for reverence, for a track record, for specific hatred of the shortcut. Those 4 things transfer. Personal loyalty to a founder doesn't transfer past that founder's own attention span. And a culture built on it collapses the moment the founder is tired, distracted, or simply not in the room, which, per the whole premise of the story, is most rooms, most of the time, in any organization past a certain size. I've watched founders get the promotion decision backwards more times than I can actually count. And it's almost never malicious. It's almost always exhaustion. The same exhaustion Jethro diagnosed in Moses. Promoting whoever's been around the longest, or whoever's easiest to talk to, or whoever's currently producing the best numbers, because evaluating for character takes longer than evaluating for output, and the business needed a decision by Friday. Every one of those shortcuts is defensible in isolation. Stacked over 3 years, they quietly become the entire personality of the company, and nobody ever choose that on purpose. It simply accumulated the way Moses' bottleneck accumulated. One reasonable decision at a time until the whole camp was standing in line that never got shorter. I sat in on a promotion conversation once, actually a couple of times, but I'm referring to a specific case. Early in my consulting years, where a founder had two candidates for the same regional lead role. One had the better numbers, visibly on every chart in the room. The other had a thinner scoreboard, but a habit well known on the team of telling the founder uncomfortable truths early rather than letting them surface later as a crisis. The founder chose the numbers. 18 months later, that region had the worst retention in the company, and an anonymous complaint eventually surfaced about exactly the kind of corner cutting the second candidate would almost certainly have flagged the moment she saw it starting. Nothing about that founder's stated values had changed in 18 months. What had changed was who he had handed the room to, and the room being a room simply because, become whoever was standing in it. So one needs to know what the room remembers. Go back to that bank, right? One more time, the initial example. Because there's a detail in stories like that, one worth carrying with you longer than the headline numbers. The investigators who eventually pieced together what happened found something almost worse than the fraud itself. Several employees had raised concerns early through the exact internal channels the company's own values page told them to use. Most of those employees were reprimanded, sidelined, or even fired, which means the actual culture, not the printed one, the operating one, had already run its own test years before the scandal broke and quietly failed it, kind of like in the room with no press coverage and no consequences at the time. The wall didn't lie about what the company wanted to be. It just had nothing to do with what the company was actually rewarding. One Friday performance review at a time. I want to be honest about why this is hard to hear, because it would be easy to leave this episode feeling like the lesson is simply watch your incentives more carefully and follow it under strategy rather than character. The truer version is less comfortable. Every one of the mechanisms today, who you keep close, who you promote, what you do the one time the truth is expensive, comes down in the end to whether you actually want to hear the thing that will cost you something, or whether you've quietly built a life where only agreeable news is allowed anywhere near you. That's not a policy question. That's a hard question wearing an organizational chart's clothes. And Solomon knew it, which is exactly why he wrote about kings and their ears instead of writing a management manual. That's the question this whole episode has been circling, and it has almost nothing to do with what you'd write on a careers page if someone asked you to. Who's currently in your presence, genuinely close, genuinely trusted, with your ear, that you've quietly decided not to remove? Because removing them would cost you something this quarter. What criteria you actually used the last time you promoted someone versus the 4 Jethro would have insisted on. What happened specifically the one time telling you the truth was expensive for the person telling it, whether they got Moses' ear or got quietly filed as a problem to manage. I don't say any of this as someone standing outside the problem, pointing a finger at a boardroom and banks. I've caught myself doing a smaller version of exactly this, softening feedback to someone I liked, letting a pattern slide a second and third time because confronting it would have cost me an uncomfortable conversation, especially one I didn't feel like having that week. The mechanism is the same size in a 2-person company as it is in a bank with 80,000 employees. It's only the zeros that change. A culture is never built by the document. It's built by the correction or the absence of one. In the one room, nobody was going to write a case study about. The room remembers what got rewarded there far longer than it remembers what got printed on the wall outside of it.